Nightmare Taxi, A Ride to Terror. It was a cold and rainy night when Sarah found herself standing on a desolate street corner, desperately searching for a taxi. She had just finished a late-night shift at work and couldn't wait to get home. As luck would have it, a yellow taxi suddenly pulled up beside her. Relieved, Sarah opened the door and stepped inside, only to be greeted by a chilling gust of wind that seemed to emanate from within the cab. The driver's face was concealed beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a heavy coat, making it impossible to discern any details. Feeling uneasy, Sarah provided her address, and the taxi set off into the night. As they ventured further away from the city lights, the streets grew eerily quiet. The driver remained silent, never uttering a word. Sarah tried to strike up a conversation, but her attempts were met with only silence. Unease settled deep within Sarah as the journey took a sinister turn. The cab passed an old cemetery, its crumbling tombstones illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows like skeletal fingers. Trying to shake off her mounting fear, Sarah glanced at the meter. To her horror, the numbers were spinning rapidly, tallying an exorbitant fare with each passing second. She called out to the driver, but he continued to ignore her, his eyes focused intently on the road ahead. The taxi veered off the main road and onto a deserted path surrounded by dense woods. Sarah's heart raced as she realized they were headed to a place far from civilization. Panic gripped her, and she frantically searched for an escape. As the taxi careened around a bend, Sarah spotted an opportunity. With a surge of adrenaline, she flung open the door and tumbled out onto the rain-soaked ground. She stumbled to her feet and turned to face the taxi, but it had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. Drenched and disoriented, Sarah stumbled through the woods, desperately seeking shelter. She eventually stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and the door hanging loosely on its hinges. Breathing the unknown horrors within, she stepped inside. The cabin's interior was just as derelict as its exterior. Rotting furniture lay scattered across the floor, cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and a musty odor filled the air. Sarah's heart sank as she realized she had entered a place long abandoned. As she explored the cabin, Sarah discovered a hidden door concealed beneath a tattered rug. Curiosity piqued. She opened it to reveal a set of descending stairs. With trepidation, she descended into the darkness below. The basement was a haunting labyrinth of dank corridors and flickering lights. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the silence as she navigated the winding paths. Then, she stumbled upon a chilling sight, an old newspaper article pinned to the wall. It chronicled a series of disappearances, all linked to the mysterious taxi driver she had encountered. Fear consumed Sarah as she realized she was trapped in the lair of a malevolent being, a supernatural entity that preyed on unsuspecting passengers. The basement seemed to tighten its grip, the walls closing in as a spectral figure materialized before her. It was the taxi driver, his face a haunting visage of malice. With a blood-curdling scream, Sarah awoke. She found herself in her own bed, drenched in sweat. It was all just a nightmare, a vivid and terrifying dream. Yet, as she caught her breath, she noticed a faint wet footprint near her bedroom door, a chilling reminder of the evil taxi driver who still haunted her thoughts even in waking life. Shaken by her nightmare, Sarah tried to brush it off and go about her day. However, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. As the days passed, strange occurrences began to happen around her. Every time she walked down the street, she felt as though someone was watching her. and she swore she could hear the sound of wheels turning, despite the absence of any cars. She started seeing the same yellow taxi parked on the corner of her street every time she left her apartment. One night, as she was walking home from work, Sarah noticed that the taxi was parked across the street from her building. The same driver, with his face still obscured, was sitting behind the wheel. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized that the taxi driver from her nightmare was now a reality. Heart pounding, Sarah began to run, but as she passed the taxi, the driver stepped out and grabbed her arm with an iron grip. She struggled to break free, but his strength was unfathomable. The driver's face was now visible, and it was the same menacing visage from her dream. Terrified, Sarah was dragged into the taxi. The doors slammed shut behind her, and the taxi started moving, careening through the streets at breakneck speed. Sarah could see nothing but darkness outside the windows, and the driver remained silent. Suddenly, the taxi came to a screeching halt, and Sarah was thrown forward, her head hitting the seat in front of her. As she looked up, she realized that they were in front of the same cabin from her dream. The driver dragged her out of the car and into the cabin, which was just as dilapidated and foreboding as it had been in her nightmare. The driver forced her down the stairs, deeper and deeper into the basement. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah realized that she was not alone. There were other people there, all bound and gagged, whimpering in terror. The taxi driver turned to face her, and his eyes glinted with an otherworldly light. "You're going to be a part of my collection," he hissed, as he slowly began to approach her. Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way to escape. Suddenly, she remembered the article she had seen in her dream. In a desperate move, she lunged for the newspaper, ripped it off the wall, and held it up in front of her, shouting an incantation she had read in the article. The driver let out a blood-curdling scream as he was engulfed in a bright white light, then vanished into thin air. The other captives were freed, and they all fled the cabin together. As they stumbled through the woods, Sarah realized that she had defeated the evil taxi driver and escaped with her life. But the horror would never truly leave her, and she would always remember the haunting fear that had almost claimed her soul. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. She knew she had to leave the cabin and get as far away as possible from the sinister entity that had invaded her dream. As she crept towards the door, Sarah heard a creaking sound. She froze in place, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a loud, guttural growl echoed through the cabin, causing her to jump in fear. Sarah backed away slowly, her heart racing as she tried to remember the way back to the entrance. However, the cabin seemed to have changed since she first arrived, and the path she had taken now seemed to lead to a dead end. Panic began to set in as Sarah realized that the cabin was alive, and it was actively trying to keep her trapped. The doors and windows shut tightly, preventing her from escaping. The growls grew louder and more frequent, accompanied by the sound of footsteps and scratching. Sarah turned around, and to her horror, saw the ghostly figure of the taxi driver standing before her, his cold eyes gleaming with malice. He was holding a sickle in his hand, and he slowly started to advance towards her. Sarah tried to run, but the cabin seemed to be alive and blocked her every move. The taxi driver continued to pursue her, his sickle glinting in the dim light. She could hear his labored breaths as he drew closer and closer, his presence sending shivers down her spine. Just as Sarah thought it was the end, she spotted a glimmer of light shining through the cracks in the floorboards. With a surge of hope, She crawled towards the light, her heart pounding with excitement. With one last push, Sarah broke through the floorboards, crashing down onto the ground outside. The rain was still pouring down, but the wind had stopped, and the thunder had ceased. As Sarah got up, she realized that she was no longer in the woods, but in a vast graveyard. The taxi driver had disappeared, but his ghostly presence lingered, and Sarah knew that she had to run. She ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her chest. The ground was uneven and slippery, and Sarah stumbled several times, nearly falling to the ground. But she kept going, driven by the desire to escape the evil that had tried to consume her. Finally, after what seemed like hours of running, Sarah spotted a light in the distance. She ran towards it, hoping that it would lead her to safety. As she got closer, she realized that it was a small church, and she could see people inside. Sarah collapsed on the steps of the church, panting and shivering from the cold rain. The door opened, and a group of concerned citizens rushed out to help her. She explained what had happened, and the group quickly realized that the taxi driver had been a notorious serial killer who had died many years ago. They knew that he would not rest until he had claimed his next victim, and that Sarah had been lucky to escape. As Sarah sat inside the warm church, surrounded by people who cared for her, she knew that she would never forget the horrors of that fateful night. She knew that she had been lucky to escape, and that she would never take her safety for granted again. With her heart racing and her mind reeling, Sarah tried to compose herself and think of a way out. But the door was sealed shut, and the windows had no bars to break. She was trapped with no way to escape. As the sun began to set, Sarah heard the sounds of rustling outside the cabin. The darkening woods seemed to come alive with an eerie energy, as if the trees themselves were closing in. Then, a faint whispering could be heard, growing louder and more insistent by the second. Sarah's skin crawled as she realized that the whispers were coming from within the cabin. She could make out the distinct sound of multiple voices, as if a group of people were trying to communicate with her from the other side of the wall. Trembling with fear, Sarah approached the wall and pressed her ear against it. The voices grew louder, and she could hear them more clearly. They were speaking in hushed tones, as if conspiring together in some terrible scheme. Suddenly, a loud knocking erupted from the wall. It sounded like someone was trying to break through from the other side. Sarah recoiled in horror as she realized that something was trying to get in. The knocking grew louder and more frenzied, and Sarah could hear the sound of nails scratching against the wood. She was trapped, with no escape and no hope of rescue. She huddled in a corner, praying that the nightmare would end. Then, in a sudden flash of insight, Sarah realized the truth behind her predicament. She was not alone in the cabin. There were spirits there, trapped and desperate to be released. They had chosen her as their vessel, and they would stop at nothing to break free. With a deep breath, Sarah closed her eyes and allowed the spirits to enter her body. She felt their cold touch as they passed through her. And then, nothing. The cabin was silent, and Sarah was alone once more. She emerged from the cabin, a changed woman. She knew the spirits would follow her wherever she went, but she was ready to face them. She would use their power to fight the darkness and protect the innocent. For Sarah had become the haunting fair, the one who would confront the supernatural entities that lurked in the shadows, and bring justice to those who